let's backtrack to the beginning of the season and a bit before. We had the Bangor survey, which showed a very low biomass, in fact the lowest since records began. Their recommendation to us was that we shouldn't fish this year to preserve stocks. We looked at that advice. In the meantime, industry indicated that they would be willing to carry out a survey, and we co-funded that with the Producers Association. They carried out a survey. They identified a hot spot, for want of a better word, off East Douglas, and in fact that's where the fishing has been taking place. The rest of the territorial sea, their survey sort of coincided with ours, overlapped from Bangor, and showed very, very few adults around the rest of the territorial sea, although looking forward with some sort of optimism, there are some areas where there are quite large concentrations of juveniles.
So the fish producers survey, that was a more extensive one, was it?
They sampled, they took more sample points than we did, or not I say we did, Bangor University did, and overlapped with ours in many places. But the area off East Douglas where they're fishing at the moment was an area that we missed, and although anecdotally the fishermen said that there were high concentrations of queen scallops, adult queen scallops there during the king scallop season, because they obviously catch them as bycatch and release them again during the king scallop season.
So this area off of East Douglas is where now you're saying is the only place in our sort of our waters that is actually going to be allowed for the rest of the season?
Well, what we've done is we looked at the 4-week point at what had been caught and where the catch was taking place, and it was obvious that they were still catching reasonably well in that area. It's a fairly tight box, probably 3.5 miles by 2 miles wide, but catches there have been good and have sustained the industry and come to its rescue in a way. And the catches continue to be reasonably good. Last week they were good, and they have now overtaken the original recommended TAC, which was a reduction of 40% on last year's TAC. So we reviewed that, and we've now reverted to the 20% minus from last year, increase the amount of catch available to fishermen, but to preserve the greater territorial sea, we've closed the rest of the fishery on the basis that they can fish to the new TAC off East Douglas in quite a large box, and or the effort to catch the rate comes down dramatically, indicating that stocks are being depleted.
For fishermen in Douglas, that sounds fairly reasonable, and for those on the East Coast, again, fairly realistic. But for the large fishing industry, of course, we have in Peel on the east coast of the island. Getting round to that catchment area is surely a tall order. You're not shutting down the entire west coast of the fishing industry there.
They haven't been fishing on the west coast, and I think the fishermen are aware that there is very little stock out there. Juvenile stock, yes, and we've got a closed area. They have been fishing in the East Douglas area because of the economics. I mean, you go where the catch is.
But now having all of the fishermen in one place, fishermen and women, I should say, in one part of the sea, isn't that going to be highly over-concentrated?
That's how the fishing's been from the beginning of the season. We track vessels in almost real time, and all the vessels have been concentrating their effort in that area. There's hardly been any fishing elsewhere, and what did take place, a boat or boats went to the chickens area and they caught nothing, so they came back to this area.
What work is being done, if any, to ensure that the issues with other areas regarding queen scallops aren't going to happen now in this one area off of East Douglas?
Well, this gives us a great opportunity to have a look at the science, and we've been treating the territorial sea as one, and I think the science is now telling us, and this is an opportunity to look at that we should be looking at spatial management, and bearing in mind queen scallops take around 3 years to mature. It might be an opportunity for us to look at where we've got high concentration of juveniles to spatially open areas to fishing, and this area off East Douglas, which hadn't been fished very heavily over the last 3 or 4 years is indicative of what can happen if areas aren't fished hard, and then perhaps we can move the effort around the islands to ensure that we've got a fishery that is sustainable rather than this big rush, catch everything, and then find, like we have off targets, for instance, and chickens, where most of the adult stock was fished out over the last 2 or 3 years, and we now have concentrations of juveniles but very few adults.
When the first limit was put in place at the start of the fishing season, there was a fairly strong reaction from local fishermen and women in Peel, especially that we spoke to. This is undoubtedly going to have another reaction. What communication are you having with those in the field?
Well, we're talking to the Scallop Board, we're talking to industry representatives generally, and also the Producers Association. So they are all in the loop. When we took the decision at the beginning of the season, I fully understand the consternation that must bring, and the fact that fishermen want to fish, but the reality is we have to balance the socio-economic with the stock that's on the ground, as it were. Now, we have been lucky, and the fishermen have been lucky, and perhaps they knew better than we did in this particular instance. I can admit that there was an area off East Douglas, but it seems to be the only area where there were a high concentration of adult queen scallops. And I'm pleased that the catch rate there has continued to be good, and will probably go on for another 2 or 3 weeks. And that has been a saving grace for the industry this year. But going forward, we have to look at the greater fishery in terms of whether it's sustainable going forward. And we want to make it sustainable so that the fishing industry has a future.
Just finally, when will the next update and review take place?
We're reviewing it on a weekly basis. Yesterday I went into the department, and we have the figures almost in real time, and we feed those out to industry as well, so they know what they're catching, where they're catching it, and what the catch rate is. And we're watching the situation carefully.